When someone arrives in Port Annie, after driving up through 100 miles of rainy forest, he finds a tiny pulp mill town clinging to the side of a mountain. This is a community made up of people who have come here to get away from somewhere else, people who have fled from their past. The visitor, like anyone who lives here, knows that someday, if it rains long enough and hard enough, the town is almost certain to slide down off that mountain and into the sea. The two most important aspects of any story for me to get it started are character and place. Often characters are suggested by place. To drive into a tiny town like Port Alice at the north end of Vancouver Island is to see a group of people clustered together on the side of a mountain. And my first experience was to suggest immediately the whole West Coast experience, sitting on the edge of the continent, waiting to be washed off into the ocean. One of the first tasks I realized I had to face in the writing of the novel, Resurrection of Joseph Bourne, was to introduce the reader to the kind of town I was going to be making use of throughout the novel. This meant taking the reader on a little trip up and down the different streets of town, meeting some of the people I thought might be interesting and who might represent the kind of people who lived there. And somewhere in this journey discovered this strange creature out in the middle of the square, dressed in a bizarre costume, and of course had to stop and find out why he was there. In fact, it was the mayor himself who was yelling directions, I believe, at youngsters about cleaning up this mess that the tidal wave had left when it had washed over the town. He became one of the many characters I was interested in, but gradually took on more and more importance as I found him more and more fascinating. During a trip to the North Island to discover whether I was getting the feeling of the small northern Vancouver Island place, while traveling around listening to people's conversations and meeting people and more or less snooping around, discovered I needed something to read and in my hotel room, and went out to a magazine shop and discovered a script, a published script of Robert Altman's Nashville. I had enjoyed the movie very much, bought the script, took it back to my hotel room, started reading it, and suddenly realized that this was the structure I wanted for the novel. I wanted to have all 5 or 6 plots going at the same time, but just to touch briefly on each one and separately on each one, back and forth and back and forth. That suggested the structure I stuck with through the novel. It drove Mayor Wiens crazy that no one out there had ever heard of his Port Annie, that year after year no real tourists ever came in to visit. He tried. Dressed in his astronaut costume, he tried to get the people of the town interested in establishing the world's biggest slug race, but it never got off the ground. How could a modern town hold up its head if it didn't have at least one tourist trap to its name? Dressed in his Thunderbird costume, he tried to get some local Indians to throw up a fake longhouse in the bush and charge people for a chance to look in an authentic Indian village. But nothing came of that. Dressed in his costume of an heroic and mythical logger, he tried to get people interested in the world's biggest beer drinking contest, but everyone just went on drinking their beer and ignored him. Finally, he had it. Inspiration. While he was pacing up and down in his Captain Vancouver costume, he was struck by a flash of genius. A giant cactus. He'd import a giant cactus from Arizona and install it down at the waterfront. 50 feet tall. An inspiring tower. A work of nature's art. A beautiful column of their faith in the future. Tourists would flock to Port Annie to see the country's biggest natural growing cactus. No question about it. Gasps of astonishment would soon be everyday fare in this town. Tourists could come racing in from all over the world just to see it, to pay to see it. Port Annie was finally about to be on the map. Wiens remained for me a cartoon figure, an object of satire, right through the working out of the plots of all these different characters I was interested in, right up to the point of the gigantic mudslide that wiped his town right off the side of the mountain into the ocean. And to the point where the survivors of the town were gathering together at the nearby squatters' flats to celebrate the fact that they were still alive and to lay plans for moving out of this area. I got very caught up in describing the celebration, the sense of joy and relief and hope amongst the survivors, and tended to forget about Weems. But at some point in the writing of this celebration, discovered there was one man at the very center of it who wasn't celebrating at all. And this, of course, was good old Weems. My heart broke when I saw that amongst all these celebrating people, he didn't know what was going on. He didn't understand.
But wait a minute. You can't just leave just because we've had a little setback. No reason to abandon the place. We'll rebuild. This is a town with spirit. The world hasn't ended yet. We've got to rebuild, to carry on. For people with the courage to stay, there'll be new buildings. The joy of seeing luxury hotels go up right here in the spot. We'll be swamped with tourists, all coming in to see the sight of this terrible slide. A new boom town will grow up, a modern city with shopping malls and subdivisions and fast food outlets, car dealers and tourist attractions, golden arches and whirling buckets of chickens. All the lovely trappings of modern cities. But they won't listen. Why am I always the only one to think about these things? What do they think they have to celebrate? Nobody listens. Nobody cares. Everything's just gone. Why should a man even try to give some meaning to life?
There are several novelists whose approach to character have been particularly attractive to me and from whom I think I've learned quite a bit. John Steinbeck, for instance, has an enormous sense of enjoying his people and having a good time with them. And this is an experience I have when I'm writing. I often get impatient with a character that I'm not enjoying, and he finds himself having to go and find another writer to write about him because he disappears off my page. I like to enjoy the people I'm writing about. William Faulkner is another writer whose approach to character interests me in the sense that he's enormously curious about what goes on inside them. I'm not usually interested in just watching people behave. I'm interested in imagining what it's like to be that person, to walk around for a while in that person's shoes. In fact, this is one of the great joys of writing fiction. You become other people than yourself and see the world with other people's eyes. At the end of Resurrection of Joseph Bourne, Weems is a man without town, without job, without role to play, and especially without his costumes. Everything has been washed away. I picked him up perhaps a year later on the streets of Tokyo when he was a little closer to understanding the new role he must learn to play.
Jacob, try to snap out of it. I sometimes think he does these things just to be sure I don't enjoy myself. Why can't you have a good time? You scare me the way you do. In a campsite in Oregon, he disappeared. They found him at the bottom of the lake. I believe he jumped in just to scare me.
I cannot believe a man like Mr. Weems is capable of doing something cruel.
Well, today he walked right out of the kabuki play just when the woman was being poisoned by her husband and flies off into the streets of Tokyo, where he ends up, I later discover, at some disgusting sumo wrestling match.
Which old Jake found to be just as dumb as everything else. You should have taken me with you,
Am I expected to eat this thing?
Hey, Jake. You know what those sumo guys remind me of?
This bohunk in the logging camp. 7 foot tall with a gun.
Never sink my teeth into something that's likely to bite me back.
Anyways, this guy.
Oh, shut up, Conrad. You're becoming a bore. To think I thought he was such a catch. Oh, my poor brother-in-law. He's feeling bad enough without having to listen to you.
Perhaps it is the unfamiliarity of everything in our city that is bothering Mr. Weems. The food, the noise, the crowds.
Nothing to do with the food. The food is lovely. Come on, you've got to eat.
Nothing to do with the food. Look at you. A lot of you. Look at me. Am I supposed to be enjoying myself here? When everywhere I go, I see people who know what they're supposed to be doing with their lives? You can tell just by looking at people in the streets. You can tell by the way they're dressed. They all know exactly. Even you, with your costumes. Here's our tourist matron. Here's our macho man. Here's our movie actress, our fading movie actress. Even Hiroshi here, dressed like all the energetic young men you see in the streets. And me. What about me?
You're trying to spoil this dinner party for me, too, aren't you? Well, I'm not going to let you. Come on, everybody, eat up. You've got to try some of that. It's delicious.
What did those sticky Fortrell pants have to do with him? Bought at a sale by Mabel somewhere. They didn't tell a thing about him. Without his town, without his job, without all the things people expect from their mayor, he was naked. He didn't know who he was supposed to be. With his Thunderbird costume and his Captain Vancouver costume and his logger costume all washed into the ocean, how would he ever know when he was being natural? Sitting on the bottom of that lake in Oregon, he had to decide to leave certain things to fate. When fate rescues you, you decide to follow your natural instincts wherever they lead. But how was he supposed to know where he was going when he didn't even know who it was he was supposed to be? There was something special about him. He knew there was. And when he found out what it was, there wouldn't be any stopping him. Just wait. Just wait and see what happens to Jacob Weems in the future. Jacob Weems is so alive to me, and was so alive to me when I finished writing the Sumo revision, that I can easily imagine him out there walking around the world, that I can easily imagine bumping into him someday. So the experience of seeing him translated to dramatization in a way is the equivalent of turning a corner and meeting Jacob Weems. He is alive. I cannot distinguish between the actor and the character. My feelings when I'm watching the actor's Jacob Weems expressing his feelings is very much the same as I had when I was watching these things happen on the page. Very, very real. I'm convinced that he walks out of that scene and continues on with his life.